Cathy Cluck. I am an AP US, AP European History teacher at Westlake High School in Austin, Texas.
Go Chaps! And I'm Emily Glankler. I graduated from Westlake High School, where Miss Cluck was my AP US History teacher. And I'm now also an AP US, AP World History teacher in Austin at the Griffin School. Go Griffins! I don't think we have a mascot. We don't play football. So.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so obviously...
That's a whole thing in Texas, by the way.
It is a big thing, and we don't do it. So people are like, are you a real school? But we are.
Yes, you are.
So obviously you're not in Austin right now.
Nope, this is not Austin behind me. That is the Manhattan skyline. I am currently in Weehawken, New Jersey. And if you know anything about your history nerdiness like I do, Weehawken is the site of the Alexander Hamilton Aaron Burr duel. I am currently on I've dubbed it the Great American History Road Trip, which a friend of mine says that I just use the longest hashtags ever. And Great American History Road Trip, I decided that if we were going to be remote for 3 weeks, that what if I, as a history teacher, just taught history from the places where history happened? So I had this crazy idea on a Friday night at like 9:30, and I texted my boss, my principal, Steve Ramsey. He was like, I love it, figure it out. Oh. And I'm like, this is nuts. And he said, I know, but figure it out. I think it's great. And 2 weeks later, I loaded up my little SUV and hit the road and drove to the East Coast from Austin over the period of several days. I've been in Jamestown, Virginia, the first American colony. I was in Yorktown, which is the final battle of the Revolution, where America got American. I was in Colonial Williamsburg, which was hysterical because of all the people walking around in their Williamsburg colonial garb, and even their masks were period specific. So like I had my mask on and they had this nice gingham something that would match their colonial outfits.
They were like so prepared for this pandemic. Colonial Williamsburg was like, we've been living like this for decades.
For sure. And the craziest thing was when I was in Jamestown, I just sort of set up camp in Jamestown all day. And one of the things that killed all the early settlers was they got malaria because it's kind of low and swampy, and I'm on the James River. And I'm not kidding, by the end of the day, I am slapping mosquitoes away, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel it.
Yeah.
I feel what the settlers went through. I get why y'all all died of malaria.
It was like the dumbest place to settle, right? It was like the dumbest place to choose. They could have chosen almost anywhere in the Americas, and they were like, this swamp looks nice.
This swamp where there's mosquitoes, and it's not even necessarily great for farming, but we'll figure that out later.
Yeah.
And we have to bring in slaves because we don't want to do it ourselves. Sure, let's set up camp there.
Yeah. We can talk about Jamestown, a whole other thing on Jamestown, because
that's a whole other story.
They like searched for gold instead of planting crops,
yes.
And then they were like, shoot, we're gonna starve. It was bad.
Yeah, apparently John Smith was like, dude, there's not gold in Virginia. Y'all better get your crap together or you're going to die.
Yeah. I remember when I was researching for a podcast on the colonial Americas, that I read on John Smith's resume, it was like very few settlers died of starvation under his rule, which was like a point of pride. Not none, just very few. Anyway.
But then it's like, what is wrong with them?
Yeah.
Plant the food, people.
Food.
You don't have an HUB.
Thank God for Pocahontas. Anyway.
Thank God. Women save the day again. So anyway, I'm now in Weehawken, New Jersey. I spent a day in Washington, D.C., and I've made my way to New Jersey. And from here on, I'm going to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania for a little Civil War action. It's just wrong on so many levels. And then who knows? I'm kind of calling it on the fly right now.
That's awesome. Yeah, because some of the places you're saying like have a like sort of quarantine in effect. So Boston's maybe not a great place to go.
Yeah, I was planning on Boston, and I've rethought that. And
yeah.
Last night I remember the news images from New York City and Boston in March and April, and I'm like, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
That's not necessary. So.
But you know, I realized it was funny because we were talking the other day and you were telling me that when you were teaching in front of the Lincoln Memorial, they were doing like sound checks and you had to leave.
Right.
And I didn't realize that was for the March on Washington.
was for the March on Washington. And I didn't realize it was the March on Washington until that night. And I was looking at stuff about March on Washington and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's right. It was on this date.
Yeah.
And I just happened to be there. I thought it was a Black Lives Matter rally,
Right.
but it was on the anniversary. It was another March on Washington, and it was the day after I was in DC, and I'm just like, there's a part of me that wishes I would have stayed, and a part of me that's like, I'm really trying to avoid crowds. So
right.
I'm trying to be safe.
Yeah.
So I probably wouldn't have gone, but that's what the sound check was for.
I think what was funny when I realized that was thinking about you as a US history teacher just complaining to your kids about like, these dudes just keep interrupting my class. And like, imagine some teacher in like the 60s that was like, some dude keeps talking about a dream and I'm just trying to teach my class.
Dude, Mr. King, Dr. King, can you just bring it down a little
bit? I'm trying to teach US history here, please. Can you stop? Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're at the place where Hamilton shot Burr.
Yes.
Which I know from the musical Hamilton.
Yes.
I knew it at some point. I'm sure you taught it to me at some point. And I knew Hamilton died in a duel, but that was all I knew. And so all I really know is from what's in the musical Hamilton. But I did a ton of research on Burr's post-murderer life, and it's dark. It's really fascinating.
And the crazy part, so just very quick background for those who haven't seen the musical. A, you need to see the musical because it's amazing. But B, Hamilton was brilliant, just brilliant, and was this prolific intellectual genius who used his time, his short life, used it well. He is the architect of the American financial system. He is the first Secretary of the Treasury. He is the reason why America sort of focused in its early years on industry and factories as opposed to agriculture, which is what Thomas Jefferson wanted. Jefferson was Hamilton was more forward thinking, I think. And our country as a country today would not be the way it exists were it not for him. He was never president. He was killed too early. And he has this super interesting personal life as well as his professional life. But what caused this duel was that in the election of 1800, he essentially criticized Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was running for the presidency against Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton did not like Jefferson. They had agreed fundamentally on sort of every political principle. And Hamilton actually came out in support of Jefferson over Burr. And then Hamilton, after Jefferson won the election, Hamilton continued to criticize Burr publicly, and Burr challenged him to a duel.
Yeah.
And the rules of duels at the time were that true gentlemen accepted the challenge, that they would meet on the dueling grounds and fire in the air and purposely miss. And that way their manhood was intact and they could still say that they didn't back down from the challenge to their honor, but then they weren't a murderer. And in this particular case, obviously we don't know everything totally for sure, but Hamilton allegedly fired in the air, Burr fired at Hamilton. And Hamilton later died of that wound.
Yeah.
Burr at the time, this is the part that's crazy, and this is what I want to turn over to you. He was the sitting vice president of the United States when this happened. So the sitting vice president of the United States committed murder and then went on the run.
Yes.
Like, he was fleeing murder charges.
He went west.
Hamilton died. Yes, Hamilton died, and Burr is now charged with murder. The sitting vice president of the United States is charged with murder and flees.
Yeah.
And we think we're in like this crazy world right now.
Yeah, it's like fake news.
All of the crazy that we're watching.
Yeah.
It like that's one thing I've sort of learned from this whole trip so far is I've gone to Civil War stuff and colonial stuff and the World War II memorial and the Vietnam memorial and I'm like, we think we have it bad now, and we do, absolutely, but we've come back from worse.
We've
And
been a hot mess since the very beginning.
yeah,
That's what I tell my students. I'm like, I literally just finished teaching my kids about like the colonies, and my
mhm,
whole thing is I'm like, we were a hot mess from the very beginning. Like Puritans were like religious freedom, but only for us. And like in Jamestown, they settled in a swamp and looked for gold. And like, and even after the revolution, like it made no sense that we would all become one country. We were
right,
like 13 different governments and
yeah,
13 different cultures, and like, yeah, we've been a mess from the beginning. This is
yeah,
nothing new.
yeah, yeah.
Which
And
is comforting? I don't know.
comforting in a weird sort
Yeah.
of like just keep poking the bruise way.
Hmm.
It's like, okay, it's still there. We're okay. We're gonna be okay.
Oh
We've
God.
gone through this stuff before, but yeah.
Yeah. The other thing too that I was looking at, so like, because the duel happened in 1804,
Hmm.
I think. So Burr was the vice president under Jefferson, and then when Jefferson was running for re-election, he was like, "I'm going to change the rules to where I can pick my own VP,
Right,
so I don't have to be with Burr."
right.
So Burr already, like, Burr is just constantly like rejected
Yes.
by the founding fathers.
Hmm.
And so then he's like, great, I'll run for governor of New York. And so it was during that election that Hamilton, people kept asking Hamilton, like, because he was in New York, like,
Right.
and he kept saying, like, no,
Nope.
I think
Nope.
Burr's garbage and, like,
Yeah.
should not be. So it was that, it was like, he'd been rejected by Jefferson as his VP again.
Hmm.
And then he hopes Hamilton will, like, support him, and Hamilton doesn't. And
Right.
so he just, yeah, he kind of, like,
It's
loses.
enough. And
Yeah.
he challenges Hamilton to this duel, and it's just like Hamilton was writing nasty stuff about him, and like, I've been doing this for years, and fine, let's just do
Yeah,
this.
the thing I think that Lin-Manuel Miranda got really right from what little I know about this is like the pettiness
Hmm.
between them. Like Hamilton was a genius, but also like couldn't help himself. He was like one of those kids that's like so much smarter than everyone else, but
Yeah.
like doesn't necessarily know when to just be quiet.
Yeah. For
You know what I mean? Be like, we
sure.
all know you're smarter than everyone
Yes.
else, but like you don't always have to prove you're smarter than everyone
Yeah.
else. Like,
Yeah.
and Burr is
Can't
like one of
stop
those that just
talking
wants
now.
to be in and like can't figure out why people don't like him. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, totally
Yeah,
true.
exactly
So
it.
Burr, when he flees, okay, I'm gonna have
Uh-huh.
to read off some of this because it's insane.
It's
So
insane.
Burr, he leaves the vice presidency at the end of his term, which I guess means he finished out his term as vice president. Well, he fled. I think he was on the run when he was finishing out his term as vice
He
president. So he
was.
fled to like South Carolina, these other places.
Right. He took on, well, there was a murder charge against him. So
Right.
there's this murder charge against him, and he's finishing out his term, and he goes on the run. And he runs to the South where I think his daughter lived. Um, and
Right.
then you pick up the story.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because I'm seeing like he never went back to New York or New Jersey because that's where the murder charge was, but he did eventually go back to Washington, D.C. to finish out his term as vice president, which is
Yes.
hilarious. It's like,
Yeah.
well, as long as I don't step into New York, I'm fine. But then, so then when he's done as vice president, he goes west, right? Jefferson had just purchased Louisiana from Napoleon.
Right.
And here's where it's like murky because there's two stories, and one is Burr's the evil dude and one is Burr's the victim. And
Uh-huh.
so he starts going out west, and as he's going, he's gathering settlers. He's like, I'm going to create a settlement in this new Louisiana territory. A lot of people think he kind of wanted to be sort of like a dictator of some new settlement.
Hmm.
And so he ends up down in Louisiana, and he ends up with a bunch of armed men, sort of a militia. He says to protect himself from Native Americans and the Spanish, who still control Texas, but other people
Hmm.
say to try to conquer Mexico.
Right.
So he goes down to
Crazy.
Louisiana, and what it seems to me is that he seemed to think that there was gonna become a war between the United States and Spain, and then he'd be
Okay.
right there on the border where he could like become a hero.
Right.
But that didn't happen.
Okay.
We ended up signing like, oh no, there's police in New Jersey. They're
Okay.
after Burr. They're still looking for him. Like I heard his name. He's a murderer.
Excellent sound effect. The warrant is still out.
So he's in Louisiana, and I think he thought like war with Spain was imminent because we were having these disputes, but then we
Mhm.
settle it with a treaty and we don't go to
Right.
war. And
Right.
so now he's like, well, I think this was going to be my way to like get back in the good graces and
To
be
be
a hero.
important. Yes. Yeah.
While he's down there too, he's sort of like gathering this militia and kind of poking at the border with Spain.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson, because of course is like, war with Spain, I'm interested.
I'm in.
Yeah. so so he's writing
Sign
letters
me
to
up.
her. He's just like ready. Jackson's like pops up anywhere. It's like, are we fighting the Spanish? And so he like is messaging Burr, sending messages, and is like, hey, I'll back you up if you need it. So Burr, I think, wants this war.
Right.
He claims, because the other thing, world history wise, is the Mexican Revolution is rising, right? The Mexican Revolution that kicks out the Spanish is going to happen in a few years. And so he also wants to maybe capitalize on that. So he's saying, I want to go into Texas and support the revolutionaries, which in this case mean a lot of white settlers in Texas, but still.
Right.
But then there's all this murkiness about that he maybe wanted to be king of Mexico.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's my understanding. I think he wanted to be king of somebody. And when it wasn't going to happen in America, he took that opportunity. There's this new Western territory. Initially, I think there were plans by him to have that new Louisiana Purchase territory to secede, and he would be the leader of that. So he was trying to organize secession for that Western territory, which is treasonous.
Yes.
And then BT dubs. And then there's also this other, like, I think he just wanted that position of power and he never got it.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is it again, the pettiness. It's no coincidence that it's like this was Jefferson's crowning achievement that he got Louisiana, and then Burr's like, fine, you don't want me as VP, I'm gonna go take over it and become king of that land or whatever.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Dude. Yeah, so he goes, and then of course he realizes the war's not coming. He realizes, oh shoot, I maybe have committed treason now in addition to killing Hamilton. And so he starts fleeing towards Spanish Florida, but he gets caught in Alabama, now Alabama, and he's confined to a fort, and he's like put on trial. And so this is the part that's really interesting. So he's put on trial. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall is the judge in the trial.
Big deal.
Big deal. He's like, it's like bringing in RBG to settle like a dispute. Yeah. And what seems to be clear is that like he was brought before a grand jury, or he was brought before different juries, like, or he was arraigned 4 times, and every time grand juries were like, no, there's not enough evidence that you committed treason, and they throw it out. But Jefferson, as the president, keeps pushing it. It's like, I want this dude convicted of treason. And so it goes to Chief Justice John Marshall, and Jefferson is full on trying to tell Chief Justice John Marshall, like, this is one of the first challenges to our checks and balances. Is he?
Yeah, and
John Marshall, like, I need you to say this guy's guilty, right?
And Marshall is Jefferson's cousin, and so there's that. Yes, Marshall and Jefferson were first cousins.
Whoa!
And even though Marshall was a Federalist and Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, they're cousins, and so Jefferson is trying to go after Burr with Marshall, who is his political opposite but is his cousin.
Whoa, I didn't know that part of it.
Yeah.
Man, it's like it's a soap opera of a bunch of privileged white dudes. Where it's like, come on, y'all. Like, you can share the wealth amongst yourself.
Political soap opera.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so then he goes on trial. There's all this hubbub because like the general who was in charge of Louisiana had been an ally of Burr and was like, I'm maybe okay if you get some more land for us from Spain. But then when this all happens, he turns and he sides with Jefferson because he doesn't want to lose his job. So the only piece of evidence against Burr is like a letter that apparently he wrote to this general that was like, I would like to commit treason now. But it's clear that the general wrote it. So it's in the general's handwriting. And people are like, well, this is clearly in your handwriting. He's like, oh, I lost the original, but I had made a copy. And John Marshall's like, no, we can't convict someone of treason because off of this. And so he's found not guilty, and he basically goes into exile. So he leaves and goes to Europe and is like, I'm out.
Yeah.
So there's a whole other element to this after that's really sad. But is there anything else I'm missing from that part of it?
No, I think you nailed it. And I think it's the story of a guy who desperately wants power and is always trying to get it and is always trying to be this like he's trying to defy his birth status. He's trying to defy his wealth, and he wants to be one of the rich popular boys.
Yeah.
And he's kind of a jerk, and nobody likes him. And so it's like his personality, he brings himself down. He
Yeah.
causes his own downfall by this weird sort of neediness.
That would be his Twitter bio, would be kind of a jerk and nobody likes him. At Aaron Burr. Well, the other thing too is like, I can also empathize because everyone else around him is doing the same stupid jerky stuff he's doing and getting rewarded for it. So like, right, Hamilton's being a jerk. Hamilton's like pushing his way into these things and everyone loves him for it. The other thing too, when I was reading this, is I'm like, he must have been furious when he read about Andrew Jackson and the War of 1812, and then Andrew Jackson like committing treason and starting war with Spain and Florida, and then he becomes president. So it's like,
and I wonder if there's I haven't studied enough about him personally, but is there just a personality flaw that he just rubbed people the wrong way?
Yeah, I mean,
because it's like, you're right, with Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida and was committing international law, and I mean violating international law, and then later becomes president. And I wonder if it was almost like just this personality quirk that people were like, you're just kind of a jerk and we don't like you.
Well, and to me, and a lot of this is coming from the musical, so who knows, but like, to me, a lot of it seems like it's like everyone else at least was like honest and was following their convictions, even if their convictions were bad. Whereas Burr, at least in Lin-Manuel Miranda's version, is always just trying to say the thing he thinks everyone wants.
Right.
And it seems like everyone can see right through it and is like, no. Like, Jackson believed he should murder the Spanish and take over Florida. And so we're like, cool, he's a straight shooter. But it's like Burr, it just seems like he's just trying all these different things, you know?
Yeah. And I agree with you that there's that line in Hamilton where he says, what do you stand for? You don't stand for anything. And it's that idea that we may be nuts and we may be kind of going full out for what we think is right, but we think it's right.
Yeah.
Like, we're willing to do the stupid thing or rub people the wrong way because we believe in the principle of it. Youth just fluctuate. And there's that scene where Burr's running for the presidency and there's all the folks on stage and they're just like, what does he stand for? I don't know. He seems like a nice guy. Oh, I would have a beer with him.
Right.
Like, nobody knows any of his principles.
Yeah.
And that becomes a thing. I mean, I think that becomes a real hindrance, that those people with principles, they see it so easily. They're like, you flip-flopped. He flipped parties just to try to win an election for the governor of New York.
Yeah. That's the other background, right? Is that he was part of wasn't he kind of Hamilton's side? He was kind of a Federalist-ish, although he would never fully claim it.
Right.
But then he's like, well, I think I can win here. And he runs against Hamilton's father-in-law in the other party. Because he's like, I think I can win there. So I think people could just see through the BS and they're like, yeah.
Exactly.
So he goes to Europe. He travels around Europe. He tries to go meet with Napoleon, and Napoleon's like, no, thank you.
Which, again, that says something about his personality. It's like, this is who you want to go meet when you're in Europe, is Napoleon, because of what Napoleon is doing.
Right.
And even Napoleon is like, yeah, no, not interested.
I'm good. I don't want to taint my legacy.
Seriously.
Of trying to conquer the world by meeting with you, Aaron Burr.
Right. You're going to bring me down.
Yeah. Like, no. And so, so then he ends up he comes back to the United States. He uses his mother's maiden name, Edwards, to avoid all the people he's in debt to, right? And then he returns to New York and just starts practicing law and is sort of like living quietly in New York. He got married. This is the part that made me, I was reading his, if I'm being honest, I was reading his Wikipedia page. Yeah. And I literally like exclaimed out loud, oh my gosh, because wait for this. So he's 77 years old. He gets married to like a wealthy widower who's like 20 years younger than he is. Their marriage only lasts 4 months. And then she files for divorce, and she hires as her divorce lawyer Alexander Hamilton Jr.
That's perfect.
Hamilton
That's
and
perfect.
Elizabeth Schuyler's third son, who's now a lawyer, and she's like, I want a divorce. Oh my God.
Divorce has always been petty.
So
I mean,
petty.
that's like Real Housewives level of petty.
Yes. And the divorce was officially completed on the
Hilarious.
day he died.
Oh, that's I mean, I shouldn't laugh
No.
because I do think there's something fundamentally flawed in a human being for him to go through all of that.
Yeah.
But that's hysterical in the sense that people don't change.
No.
That really is reality TV kind of
Yeah.
level of pettiness, and they were doing it in the 1800s.
The other thing that, again, going back to what we were talking about before, is like he died in 1836. So it's like he had to sit in New York and watch. Like he had to watch Jackson become the people's
Yeah,
president and be like, but I
yeah,
did that first. Like I tried to
yeah,
invade Florida and you hated me for it. Like he had to watch all these things happening, and he's just sitting there practicing law, like kind of trying to hide away when all he wanted was to be famous and loved, and like to have
yeah,
to live that long and see how much everyone not hates you, forgets you, like doesn't care about you at
yeah,
all, I feel
yeah.
like is so sad,
That's very sad.
you know?
And the book that I brought with me, The Heartbreak of Aaron Burr, it's by a UT professor named H.W. Brands, who is one of my history sort of heroes. And whenever he whenever he comes on a video that we're watching in my classes, I'm always telling my kids, I'm like, if you're going to UT, you need to get in this guy's classes. He's amazing. I've heard him lecture, blah, 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 blah. But the the reason I bought the book is because I want to know more about Burr the human.
Yeah.
And he obviously had this great love for Theodosia, and she was married before. She was married to a British officer. That's how he met her during the Revolutionary War. He 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 apparently really, really loved her. They finally got married. She got divorced, or the British officer was killed, maybe. Um, and he married her. They had a baby, baby Theodosia. And she died, and it was like this great heartbreak in his life. And so I know he loved. I know that he had that
Yeah.
ability. It wasn't just all about himself.
Yeah.
As a as sort of a character study, he's fascinating.
So interesting. Well, and I was just reading too that like so Theodosia, his daughter, yeah, she well, so he had a son, Aaron Burr
Mm-hmm.
Alston, who died at age 10 of a fever. Then his daughter
Oh,
Theodosia died in 1812. She was lost at sea off the
yes.
Carolinas and
Oh,
either
that's
murdered
awful.
by pirates or shipwrecked in a storm. So if you can imagine, like as a parent, the worst possible way to lose a
Right,
child is to like not ever know. Like,
right.
yeah, I just think he had such a sad life. Now, with that being said, he'd done a lot of the terrible things by that point. So it's not like we can say, oh, because of that, right?
Right.
In world history, I like to talk about Ivan the Terrible and be like, he actually did most of his terrible stuff after his wife died. So in a weird way,
Yeah.
maybe he just
You
really
can
loves his
see
wife.
some sort of cause.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I think he's super fascinating, and I think his life is so sad, but it's so
Mhm.
sad. And I feel like I know him. Like I feel like I can see him, real tragedies happen to him, but I
Mhm.
can see him then blaming all of his misfortune on those and not at
It
all understanding. You know what I mean? Like he just seems like one of those people that would be like,
victim
well, look at all
mentality.
the sad things that have happened to me that are
Yes.
unfair, but he's like unable to take accountability on like, but also I tried to be king of Mexico and that wasn't
Right.
great.
Right. He seems to be one of those people that really does employ the victim mentality.
Yeah.
That, oh, poor me, this has happened to me. But then it's like, I mean, I can see that, and that's why I think just as a character study, he's fascinating. But you look at Alexander Hamilton, who was orphaned
Yeah.
and worked his, it's like you have two kids who are both born into some pretty crappy circumstances, and one overcomes and one sort of blames everybody else.
Yeah,
And
that's a really good point. Yeah, I think
so
that's why this is so fascinating, is because it is like when you find people like this in history, I feel this way about Andrew Jackson too, where I'm like, oh, I know that guy. Like, you know what I mean?
mhm,
When you read about them, you're like, nope, that's totally human. I've met
yeah,
people like that. I
yeah,
can totally see how this would be like. We think that when they're old and they're like famous or whatever, that they're somehow totally different than us. And I'm like, no, 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 I've met that kid before. It's super
Yes,
fascinating.
exactly. And that's what I love about Hamilton the musical, because we see him as a human being, and
Mhm.
it's something that as history teachers, I think we're always trying to get our students to remember these are people. They
Mhm.
have emotions. They're not just in a chapter in a book
Yeah.
that you have to memorize to do a test well. I mean, they are when we step back and we look at the emotions and the individuality, that to me is why I love history. I mean,
Yeah.
it's fascinating. It's like, yeah, I would be that petty, or I would I would say something that stupid, or
Yeah.
like you find pieces of yourself in all of these historical figures, and all of a sudden they're not just historical figures in a book, they're real life people
Yeah.
that you can go, oh, I relate too hard to that and I'm embarrassed that I do.
Yeah.
So it's part of what I mean, what this whole trip is about is in a this is the cheesiest thing I'm about to say,
Do it.
but it really is trying to bring history to life. It's
Yeah.
like I mean, this was real, and it was people's lives that were affected, and it's so easy. And I think especially now, it's so easy to be a couple of steps removed from each other. We're in a pandemic. We're supposed to be removed from each other,
Yeah.
but but that isolation and that step away from humanity has kind of got us to this society level of, you're a Republican, I hate you, or you're a Democrat, I hate you, or you believe in this, I hate you. It's like this all or nothing,
Yeah.
and people are complicated.
Yeah. We're all
I
just people
mean,
trying to figure it out. We're
we're
all
all
just,
just trying to figure it out. And
yeah.
Aaron Burr, it's like there are things that the more I study about any of these historical people, I'm like, there are things that I sympathize with, and they're
Mhm.
likable, and things that I'm like, you're so gross and ooh, but that's because they're human. And it's
Right. Yeah, so it's
what,
sort of like we could have a whole other conversation about like, do we cancel Aaron Burr? I
yeah,
mean, I think what you're
exactly.
talking about is like we've gotten to this point where we're like, well,
Yes,
they did terrible things, and so we should never talk about them again, or we should pretend they didn't exist. And it's like,
right,
no, no one's no, first of all, no one's putting up statues to Aaron Burr, which is
right.
probably he's rolling over in his grave, waiting for someone to put a
He
statue up.
wishes
Yeah, he
he
wishes someone
wishes
put a
he could have
statue
a
up.
statue.
But it's like, yeah, I think that's the point, is understanding that like the people in the past weren't better than us or worse than us. They were just, it's like they were exactly the same. And to me,
Yeah,
like what you're saying too is like, I think there's also a future element to it too. I like to talk to my kids about like, so you could be one of these bold words in the textbook. Like
yeah,
you're a person just
yeah,
like they were. And so it's like something that you're especially right now, things we're living through right
absolutely.
now. Like Colin Kaepernick might be in a textbook one day, and your
Yeah,
grandkids are gonna be like, "What was that like?" And you're like, "I don't know. He's just a football player to me." But like,
right,
you know what I mean? There are just things that are gonna
right.
be then in the textbook that you're like, "Well, that's weird," because that was just me or my life or whatever I experienced, and that's how they
Uh-huh.
felt too. So
Yeah, and again, even back in March when we were all going home for spring break, and then we never went back. I I was telling my class, I was like, this is a big deal. This
yeah,
is a global pandemic, and nobody has lived through this, and we don't know how to do this. And aside from the fear and the scariness and the unknown, kind of look at it as this, like, I understand that you are living through history,
hmm,
that this particular event is something that you're going to tell your children and your grandchildren about, and I don't know what it's going to look like on the other end,
yeah,
but pay attention, because this is a historical moment, and to be able to recognize this is a historical moment.
yeah.
And it just, like, they didn't know how it was going to play out. We didn't know what the end result was going to be for Aaron Burr. We didn't know that Alexander Hamilton would die in a duel. That's a stupid way to
What a
die.
dumb way to
Like,
die.
for
Yeah, so
so
it's
many.
like our advice to our students is like pay attention, be documenting things, keep a journal, and also don't kill the Secretary of the Treasury and don't try to
Right,
become King of Mexico.
don't get in duels. Duels
Yeah,
are stupid
some
and
easy
illegal.
lessons.
Yes, and don't try to become the king of Mexico. And we're good.
You'll be
I
good. You'll
think
be
that's
fine.
it.
You won't die in obscurity in New York probably. So, oh man.
Crazy.
Okay. Well, that was awesome and super fascinating. Uh, Thank you, Cathy Cluck, for joining me. I'm just kidding.
Thank you, Emily Glankler, for joining me.
Maybe I think we should do this again. I think we should find another topic that we can just rant about for a little bit. But yeah, I'm gonna be putting this on. I'm gonna be putting this on my YouTube channel, and I think I might take the audio and make a bonus episode of my podcast, so people who listen to the podcast can listen to it too. So yeah, and maybe we'll see. We'll see if we can find another time, whether you're on your road trip or when you're back in Austin, to get together again.
I would love it. Nerdy history conversations, I am in.
Yeah, it's the best.
Send me the link and I'll post the link on all of my stuff too. And send me all of your tags and whatever
hashtags I'm supposed to use. I'll make the longest hashtag ever for you. Be like Emily Glankler and Cathy Cluck on the Great American History Road Trip.
Yes, I'm totally going to use that. That is going to be on Twitter when I post this link.
That's it. There we go. Oh, man. Okay, well, have fun on your trip and drive safely.
All right. Thanks. I'll talk to you later. Bye.